Under the silver light of a Texas moon, Charlotte Fletcher ran as though the devil himself pursued her. Her bare feet slapped against the hard-packed earth, each impact sending shock waves of pain through her exhausted body. Blood from a dozen cuts mingled with the dust, leaving faint crimson footprints in her wake, like breadcrumbs marking her desperate flight across the endless prairie. The tall buffalo grass whipped at her calves as she pushed forward, her cotton dress, once white, now torn and stained with sweat and dirt clinging to her trembling frame. Behind her, the thunder of hoofbeats grew louder, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to match the frantic beating of her heart. Men's voices, coarse and determined, carried across the open land on the warm night breeze. "I see her, there she is." A gruff voice bellowed the words, slicing through the darkness like a blade. "They get the girl, don't let her reach the creek." Charlie, as everyone but her stepfather called her, cast a desperate glance over her shoulder. 3 riders silhouetted against the midnight sky, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust that caught the moonlight like ghostly phantoms. They were closing the distance with terrifying speed, their mounts fresh, while she had been running for nearly 2 hours. Her lungs burned with each desperate breath, the dry Texas air scraping her throat raw. Her legs trembled with fatigue, muscles cramping from the endless miles she had covered since slipping away from the farmhouse when Maxwell's men had fallen into drunken sleep after celebrating their blood money. The image of what she'd witnessed earlier that day flashed before her eyes, with crystal clarity: Maxwell Holden and his gang cornering the railroad official in their barn. The man's face had been pale with terror as he'd tried to negotiate, offering them half the money in exchange for his life. But Maxwell had only laughed that cold, calculating laugh that had haunted Charlie's nightmares for years. She could still see the glint of the knife in Maxwell's hand, still hear the wet sound it made as it found its mark. The spray of blood across the hay-covered floor. The railroad man's desperate pleading fading to horrifying silence. Then the methodical counting of coins and bills afterward, Maxwell's cruel laughter echoing in the barn as his men divvied up their prize. James Wilson, that had been the man's name. She'd heard Maxwell mention it to Dawson, his right-hand man. Wilson had been carrying the weekly payroll for the railroad crew working the new line to San Antonio. Enough money to tempt men like Maxwell Holden, men who saw other people's lives as obstacles to be removed rather than fellow human beings deserving of mercy. Charlie stumbled on a hidden prairie dog hole and fell hard, the impact driving the breath from her lungs. Sharp stones bit into her palms as she scrambled to rise, and she felt something warm trickling down her shin where she'd scraped it against a rock. Pain shot through her ankle, twisted but not broken. She could still run, had to keep running. Too late. The riders were nearly upon her now. "Nowhere left to run, girl," called the lead rider, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a predator who had cornered his prey. Charlie recognized him as Buck Morrison, one of Maxwell's most trusted men, his face twisted into a grotesque smile beneath his hat brim that made her stomach turn. "Mr. Holden wants a word with his darling stepdaughter." The mockery in his voice made her skin crawl. Darling stepdaughter, as if Maxwell Holden had ever shown her anything but cruelty and contempt since the day he'd married her mother 5 years ago. Charlie backed away, her gaze darting around desperately for any escape route. There was nothing but open prairie for miles, in every direction, the endless expanse of grassland offering no shelter, no sanctuary. The nearest settlement was Millerville, more than 20 miles to the east, and she'd never make it on foot with her injured ankle. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird desperate to break free. This was how it would end, just like her grandmother, just like anyone who stood in Maxwell Holden's way. Rose Hawk had tried to warn people about Maxwell's true nature, and look what it had gotten her. A lonely grave and a stepdaughter who hadn't been strong enough to protect her. The sound of another horse approaching from the east made her turn hope and despair warring in her chest. A fourth rider approaching fast, her heart sank even further. Another of Maxwell's men cutting off her last possible escape route toward the creek. But as the newcomer drew closer, Charlie realized something was different. This rider came alone, and there was something in the way he sat his horse, confident, purposeful, but not predatory, that set him apart from Maxwell's usual crew. The newcomer rode a powerful chestnut stallion, its coat gleaming like burnished copper in the moonlight. The rider's face was obscured by the shadow of his hat brim, but she could see he was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle. He rode like the wind itself, man and beast, flowing as one across the moonlit landscape. As he drew closer, Charlie saw with a shock of recognition that he wasn't one of Maxwell's gang at all. The stranger's eyes caught the moonlight, intense, focused, determined. And in them, she saw not the cruel calculation she'd grown accustomed to in the men who served her stepfather, but something that looked almost like rescue. This way. He called, his voice carrying clearly across the prairie as he maneuvered his horse alongside her with practiced skill. He extended his hand toward her, and she could see the calluses on his palm and the strong fingers that spoke of hard work and honest labor. "Take my hand." Charlie hesitated for only a heartbeat, her mind racing through the possibilities. This could be a trap. Maxwell was cunning enough to send someone she didn't recognize to gain her trust. But the shouts from her pursuers were growing closer, and Morrison was already reaching for the rope coiled on his saddle. Whatever this stranger's intentions, they couldn't be worse than what awaited her with Maxwell's men. She reached up, feeling the stranger's strong grip close around her wrist like an iron band. His hands were warm and steady, and she felt a jolt of something she hadn't experienced in years: safety, or at least the promise of it. With a powerful movement that spoke of years in the saddle and muscles honed by hard work, he swung her up behind him in one fluid motion. Charlie barely had time to settle herself before he spurred his horse forward, the stallion responding instantly to his touch. "Hold tight," he commanded, his voice calm but urgent. "And keep your head down." Charlie wrapped her arms around the man's waist, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing even in the face of danger. The stallion leapt forward, its powerful muscles bunching beneath them as it accelerated to a full gallop. She could feel the animal's strength and speed as they flew across the prairie, the ground blurring beneath them. Behind them, angry shouts erupted from Morrison, and his companions followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. Charlie pressed her face against the stranger's back, feeling the rough fabric of his shirt and the warmth of his body shielding her from the chaos behind them. But the stranger's horse was remarkable, incredibly fast and sure-footed, even in the uncertain moonlight. Within minutes, the sounds of pursuit began to fade, swallowed by the vast expanse of the Texas night. The stallion's hooves drummed a steady rhythm against the earth, carrying them away from danger with each powerful stride. They rode in tense silence for what felt like hours, the stranger guiding his horse with quiet confidence through the darkness. The moon illuminated their path as they left the open prairie behind and entered more rugged terrain. Hills rose around them like sleeping giants, dotted with scrubby mesquite trees and limestone outcroppings that caught the silver light. The stranger seemed to know exactly where he was going, navigating the winding paths and hidden trails with the assurance of someone who had traveled this country many times before. Charlie found herself studying his profile in the moonlight, the strong line of his jaw, the way he held himself in the saddle with easy authority, the careful way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for any sign of danger. After what felt like an eternity of riding, he finally began to slow the horse, leading it toward a rocky outcropping that was barely visible in the dim light. As they drew closer, Charlie realized there was something unusual about the rock formation, a narrow opening in the stone face, almost completely hidden by a curtain of hanging vines and wild grape that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. "We'll be safe here." The stranger said, his voice low and steady, the first words he'd spoken since their escape began. "They won't find this place. I've used it before." He dismounted with fluid grace and reached up to help her down. As Charlie slid from the saddle, her injured ankle, forgotten in the adrenaline of their flight, suddenly gave way beneath her weight. She would have fallen hard if not for the stranger's quick reflexes. His strong hands caught her by the waist, steadying her with gentle firmness. "You're hurt." He observed concern evident in his voice, as he noted the way she favored her right foot. "I'm fine." Charlie insisted automatically, though she couldn't hide her wince as she tried to put weight on the ankle. Years of living under Maxwell's roof had taught her to minimize her injuries, to never show weakness that could be exploited. "Stubborn, aren't you?" There was a hint of amusement in his tone, but no mockery. "Come on, lean on me. Let's get you inside where I can take a proper look at that ankle." He supported her weight as he led her into the cave, and Charlie was surprised by the gentleness of his touch, so different from the rough handling she'd grown accustomed to. Inside, the temperature dropped noticeably, a welcome relief from the oppressive heat of the summer night. The cave was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a sandy floor and smooth walls that suggested it had been carved by water over countless years. The stranger helped her settle on a flat rock that served as a natural bench, and then returned to his horse. He moved with economic efficiency, retrieving saddlebags and leading the animal deeper into the cave, where the sound of dripping water indicated a small underground spring. When he returned, he carried a bundle of dry kindling and a well-used tinderbox. With practiced movements that spoke of countless nights spent in the wilderness, he built a small fire in a ring of stones that had clearly been used for this purpose before. As the flames caught and grew, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls, Charlie got her first clear look at her rescuer. He was indeed tall, probably just over 6 feet, with the broad shoulders and lean, muscular build of a man who lived hard and worked harder. His face was deeply tanned from long days under the unforgiving Texas sun, with the kind of weathered look that came from years of outdoor labor. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he was approaching 30, and his dark hair showed traces of premature silver at the temples. But it was the scar that drew her attention most, a long, jagged line that ran from his right temple down to his jawline, standing out pale and stark against his bronze skin. It was an old wound, fully healed, but prominent, the kind of mark left by a blade or perhaps a bullet. Charlie had seen enough violence in her life to recognize the signs of a man who had faced death and survived to tell about it. His eyes were perhaps his most striking feature. A brilliant blue that seemed to catch and hold the firelight, standing out sharply against his weathered features. They were intelligent eyes, watchful and assessing, but not cold. There was warmth there, and something that might have been kindness, though it was tempered by a wariness that suggested he'd learned not to trust too easily. But what truly caught Charlie's attention, what made her breath catch in her throat, was the faded bandana around his neck. The fabric was soft with age and wear, but the pattern was unmistakable, distinctive red and blue geometric designs that sent a jolt of recognition straight through her heart. The pattern was identical to her grandmother's shawl, the one that had disappeared after Rose Hawk's death. Charlie had assumed Maxwell had burned it, along with most of her grandmother's other possessions, erasing the last traces of the woman who had dared to stand up to him. But here it was worn around the neck of this mysterious stranger who had appeared like an answer to prayer in her darkest hour. The stranger knelt before her, his movements careful and deliberate, as he examined her injured ankle with surprisingly gentle hands. His touch was professional, impersonal, but she could feel the warmth of his skin through the thin fabric of her torn stocking. "Name's Mason Reed," he said, not looking up from his examination of her swollen joint. "I work for the Texas Central Railroad, investigating thefts and other irregularities." "Charlotte Fletcher," she replied, studying his face carefully for any reaction to her name. "Everyone calls me Charlie." "Well, Charlie," he said finally, looking up to meet her gaze with those penetrating blue eyes, "you've got quite a few cuts that need tending, and this ankle's starting to swell something fierce. Mind telling me why Maxwell Holden's men were chasing you across open country in the middle of the night?" The direct mention of her stepfather's name made Charlie stiffen involuntarily. How could this stranger possibly know about Maxwell? The railroad connection might explain it. Maxwell had been targeting railroad shipments for months. But something in Mason's tone suggested a more personal knowledge. "How do you know Maxwell Holden?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral despite the fear coiling in her stomach. A shadow crossed Mason's face, and for a moment the warmth disappeared from his eyes, replaced by something cold and hard. "Let's just say our paths have crossed before," he said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "And not in any way that left me with fond memories." He reached for his canteen and pulled a clean cloth from his saddlebag, then began the careful process of cleaning the cuts on her feet. "Now, this might sting a bit," he warned, dampening the cloth with water from his canteen. As he began to clean the wounds, Charlie hissed in pain, but forced herself not to pull away. The firelight danced across his features as he worked, highlighting the sharp angles of his face and the network of small scars that spoke of a hard life lived on the edge of violence. His hands were heavily calloused, but surprisingly gentle as he tended to her injuries, and she found herself wondering what kind of man worked for the railroad, but moved through the wilderness like a ghost. "You didn't answer my question," he said after a moment, his attention focused on bandaging her ankle with strips of clean cloth torn from what looked like a spare shirt. "What did you see that sent you running into the night with Holden's dogs on your trail?" Charlie weighed her options carefully. This man had saved her life, but trust didn't come easily after 5 years under Maxwell Holden's roof, where a careless word or misplaced confidence could result in a beating or worse. Still, she had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to, and that bandana around his neck suggested connections she didn't fully understand, but desperately wanted to explore. "I saw something I wasn't supposed to see," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper in the flickering firelight. "Maxwell and his men killed a man today. A railroad man." Mason's hands stilled for a moment, the cloth suspended halfway around her ankle before resuming their methodical work. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the tension beneath the surface. "James Wilson," he said quietly, "the paymaster." Charlie's eyes widened in surprise. "You knew him." He was delivering funds for the next section of track construction. Mason replied, finishing the bandage and sitting back on his heels. "When he didn't return to camp by nightfall, they sent me to look for him." His jaw tightened, and Charlie could see the muscles working beneath his skin. "Found his body in a ravine about 3 miles from Holden's property. Stripped of money and made to look like he'd fallen from his horse. It wasn't an accident." Charlie said, the horrible scene replaying in her mind with vivid clarity. "They cornered him in our barn. He begged for his life, offered them half the money if they'd let him go." She swallowed hard-tasting bile. Maxwell laughed at him. Then he used his knife. Mason nodded grimly, rising to his feet and moving to sit on a rock across from her. The fire crackled between them, casting shifting shadows on the cave walls and illuminating the grim determination in his expression. "The railway company's been hemorrhaging money for months," he said. "Supplies vanishing, payrolls, robbed equipment, sabotaged, always made to look like accidents or random banditry." He leaned forward, his intense gaze fixed on her face. "But there's been a pattern to it, intelligence behind the attacks that suggested inside knowledge. I've been investigating it for weeks now, trying to trace the connection back to its source." In the dancing firelight, Charlie's gaze was drawn again to the bandana around his neck. The pattern seemed to pulse with meaning in the shifting light, and she found herself unable to look away from the familiar geometric designs that had once decorated her grandmother's shoulders. Mason noticed her staring and reached up to touch the faded cloth self-consciously. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Charlie hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. "That bandana," she said finally. "The pattern is unusual." Mason's expression changed subtly, and she saw a flicker of something pain-guilt regret cross his features before his face settled back into its stoic mask. His hand lingered on the fabric for a moment before falling back to his side. "It was a gift," he said simply, his voice rough with some emotion she couldn't identify. "From someone who helped me when I needed it most. Someone who didn't deserve what happened to her." Before Charlie could press further, a sound from outside the cave made them both freeze. It was faint, but unmistakable, the distant whinny of a horse followed by men's voices carrying on the night breeze. Mason moved quickly to the cave entrance, his hand automatically going to the revolver at his hip. Charlie held her breath, listening to the sounds that seemed to drift closer and then fade again. After several tense minutes, Mason returned to the fire, his expression grim but relieved. "They're searching the main trails," he said quietly. "But they don't know about this place. We should be safe here for the night." He settled back onto his rock, but Charlie could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes kept drifting toward the cave entrance. This was a man accustomed to danger. She realized someone who had learned to sleep with one ear open and one hand on his gun. "Get some rest," he said, his voice gentler than before. "Tomorrow I'll take you somewhere safe." "Where?" Charlie asked, suddenly realizing the full extent of her predicament. She couldn't return to the Holden farm. Maxwell would kill her for what she'd witnessed, if not immediately, then slowly and cruelly. But where else could she go? She had no money, no relatives, no friends who would dare cross Maxwell Holden. "There's a railroad camp about half a day's ride from here," Mason replied. "Good people running it, Franklin and Eleanor Monroe. They'll help you, no questions asked." Charlie wanted to ask more questions about the camp, about his connection to her grandmother, about the scar on his face and the shadows in his eyes. But exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the desperate flight was wearing off, leaving her feeling drained and hollow. Despite her best efforts to stay alert, her eyelids grew heavy. The warmth of the fire, the relative safety of the cave, and the reassuring presence of Mason Reed all combined to pull her toward sleep. She fought it for a while, unwilling to be vulnerable in the presence of a stranger. But eventually her body's need for rest overcame her caution. Mason seemed to sense her internal struggle. "Rest," he said, his voice carrying a note of gentle command. "I'll keep watch. You're safe here." As Charlie finally surrendered to exhaustion, curling up on the sandy floor of the cave, with her head pillowed on her arms, her last conscious thought was of the bandana around Mason Reed's neck. Somehow, impossibly, a piece of her grandmother's world had found its way to this mysterious stranger who had appeared exactly when she needed him most. In the morning, she would demand answers. For now, it was enough to know that she was alive, and for the first time in 5 years, truly safe. Dawn painted the Texas sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold when Charlie awoke to the sound of crackling wood and the rich aroma of coffee brewing. For a disorienting moment, she didn't recognize her surroundings, the rough stone walls, the dying embers of a fire. The feeling of safety that had been absent from her life for so long. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back in vivid detail. The desperate flight across the prairie, the pounding hoofbeats of her pursuers, the mysterious stranger on the chestnut stallion who had swept her away from certain death. Mason Reed sat at the cave entrance, his tall frame silhouetted against the morning light, streaming through the opening. He looked as though he hadn't slept at all, his posture alert and watchful, as his eyes constantly scanned the landscape outside. The fire had been rebuilt and tended, and a small pot of coffee bubbled at its edge, filling the cave with its welcome aroma. Charlie tried to sit up, immediately wincing as she put pressure on her injured ankle. The pain was sharp, but manageable. The swelling had gone down somewhat during the night, and Mason's careful bandaging had helped stabilize the joint. The sound of her movement drew Mason's attention. He turned those startling blue eyes toward her, and she saw relief flicker across his weathered features. "How's the ankle?" he asked, rising gracefully and moving toward her with the easy, economical movements of a man accustomed to living in the wilderness. "No better," Charlie replied, testing her weight on it carefully. It was true, while still tender, the ankle felt much more stable than it had the night before. "Thank you for—" She gestured vaguely around the cave, encompassing his care, his protection, his unexpected kindness. One corner of Mason's mouth quirked up in what might have been a smile. "Stubborn as I thought, but honest about it. That's something at least." He moved to the fire and poured coffee into a battered tin cup, offering it to her with hands that she noticed were steady despite what must have been a sleepless night. "Drink this. We should move soon. Your stepfather's men won't give up easily, and they'll be ranging farther from the main trails today." The coffee was strong and bitter, but welcome after the long night. As Charlie drank, she studied Mason in the clear light of morning, noting details that had been obscured by darkness and firelight the night before. He looked even more weathered than she had initially thought, with a weariness in his eyes that spoke of burdens carried for too long. There were silver threads in his dark hair that she was certain hadn't been there 5 years ago, and new lines around his eyes that suggested recent stress or grief. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, suddenly voicing the question that had been nagging at her since their escape. "You don't know me. You put yourself at considerable risk coming after Maxwell's men like that." Mason paused in the act of checking his horse's tack, his back turned to her. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "Let's just say I've seen what happens to those who cross Maxwell Holden. Nobody deserves that fate, especially not—" He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. "Especially not what—" Charlie pressed, sensing that he had been about to say something significant. "Especially not Rose Hawk's granddaughter," he said quietly, finally turning to face her. The words hit Charlie like a physical blow. She set down the coffee cup with shaking hands, staring at him in shock. "You knew my grandmother?" Mason nodded slowly, his expression guarded. "I did. She was a remarkable woman." "How—" The word came out as barely a whisper. "When she never mentioned—" 2 years ago." Mason said, his voice taking on a distant quality as he looked back into memories that were clearly painful. "I was tracking a gang of cattle rustlers who turned out to be connected to Maxwell Holden's operation. Got careless, walked into an ambush." His hand unconsciously moved to the scar on his face. "They left me for dead in a ravine about 10 miles from your farm." Charlie listened with growing amazement as Mason continued his story, painting a picture of her grandmother that was both familiar and startlingly new. Rose Hawk finding him unconscious and bleeding, dragging him to safety despite her advanced age and small stature. The days spent hidden in a cave, not unlike this one, while Rose used her knowledge of traditional medicine to heal his wounds and nurse him back to health. "She saved my life," Mason said simply. "More than that, she gave me a purpose. Told me about the things she'd seen, the people who had disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances, all with one connection: Maxwell Holden." "But why didn't she tell me?" Charlie asked, hurt evident in her voice. "Why didn't she mention you when she came home?" Mason's expression softened slightly. "She was protecting you. Rose knew that Holden was suspicious of her, that he was looking for any excuse to—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Charlie understood. Maxwell had been looking for a reason to eliminate Rose Hawk, and any association with someone investigating his activities would have provided the justification he needed. "What happened to her?" Charlie asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Maxwell said she died of fever, but I never believed it. She was never sick, never showed any signs of illness. Mason's face hardened, and she saw a cold fury in his blue eyes that made her shiver despite the warmth of the cave. Maxwell Holden murdered her, he said flatly. Shot her down like a dog when she tried to warn a railroad surveyor about one of his planned robberies. The confirmation of what Charlie had long suspected hit her like a punch to the stomach. She had known somewhere deep in her heart that Maxwell was responsible for Rose Hawk's death, but hearing it stated so baldly made it real in a way that mere suspicion never had. I tried to stop them. Mason continued, his voice rough with old pain and guilt. But I was outnumbered. By the time I fought my way free, it was too late. Rose was dying, and Holden's men thought they'd killed me too. But you survived, Charlie said quietly. Barely. Rose used the last of her strength to drag me to safety, to bind my wounds with strips torn from her own dress. His hand went to the bandana around his neck. She gave me this before she died. Made me promise something. Charlie's breath caught. What promise? Mason's eyes met hers across the firelit space, and she saw a depth of commitment in them that took her breath away. To watch over her granddaughter. To protect you if Holden ever came after you directly. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. Mason's appearance at exactly the right moment, his knowledge of the area, his willingness to risk his life for a stranger. It all made sense now. He had been watching, waiting, keeping faith with a promise made to a dying woman. You've been watching the farm, she said. It wasn't a question. For 2 years, Mason confirmed. Waiting for an opportunity to gather enough evidence to bring Holden down legally, and watching for any sign that you were in immediate danger. And last night, I saw you run. Saw them chase after you. His jaw tightened. I couldn't let Rose down again. The weight of his words, the depth of his loyalty to her grandmother, overwhelmed Charlie for a moment. She had thought herself completely alone in the world, abandoned and forgotten. Instead, she had been watched over, protected by a guardian angel she had never known existed. Before she could respond, the sound of distant hoofbeats drifted into the cave, causing both of them to freeze. Mason moved swiftly to the entrance, peering out carefully, before returning with a grim expression. They're expanding their search pattern, he said tersely. We need to move now. Within minutes, they had broken camp and were mounted on Mason's stallion, riding deeper into the hill country. The landscape around them was rugged and beautiful, filled with hidden canyons and secret valleys that provided natural concealment from pursuing riders. As they traveled, Mason shared more details about the railroad camp where they were headed. Franklin Monroe was the construction supervisor, a former Union officer who ran his operation with military precision, but treated his workers fairly. His wife Eleanor had been a nurse during the war, and now served as the camp's unofficial doctor and mother figure to the younger workers. They've had their own troubles with Holden, Mason explained as they paused to rest the horse beside a clear stream. Lost 2 supply wagons to his men last month, and one of their surveyors was badly beaten when he stumbled across something he shouldn't have seen. The sun was high overhead when they finally crested a ridge and saw the railroad camp spread out in the valley below. It was larger than Charlie had expected, a sprawling collection of tents, wooden buildings, and rail cars that housed nearly 50 workers and their families. Smoke rose from cooking fires and a portable forge, while the constant sound of hammering and sawing indicated ongoing construction. At the edge of the camp, Mason drew his horse to a halt and let out a distinctive whistle. 3 short blasts, followed by 2 longer ones. Almost immediately, a tall, broad-shouldered man emerged from the largest building, shading his eyes against the sun as he looked up at them. Reed. The man called, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. About time you showed up. We were starting to worry that... His words trailed off as he noticed Charlie seated behind Mason on the horse. Franklin. Mason acknowledged with a nod as they rode into the camp proper. I need your help. Franklin Monroe was indeed an impressive figure, probably in his mid-50s, with iron-gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard that couldn't quite hide the strength of his jaw. Despite being obviously past his prime, he moved with the vigorous stride of a much younger man, and Charlie could see the military bearing that Mason had mentioned. "I can see that," Franklin replied, his keen eyes taking in Charlie's condition, the torn dress, the bandaged ankle, the exhaustion that must have been written clearly on her face. Without hesitation, he stepped forward as Mason dismounted and helped Charlie down from the horse. "Miss, you look like you've been through hell itself. This is Charlotte Fletcher." Mason explained, his voice carrying a note of urgency. "She witnessed the Wilson murder. Holden's men were hunting her down when I found her." Understanding dawned immediately in Franklin's weathered features. James Wilson had been well liked among the railroad men, and his death had hit the camp hard. The knowledge that his murder had been witnessed, that there might finally be justice for the gentle paymaster, brought a hard light to Franklin's eyes. "Miss Fletcher," he said formally, "you're safe now. You have my word on that." Before Charlie could respond, a woman appeared on the porch of the main building, alerted by the voices. She was perhaps 45, slender, but strong-looking, with warm brown eyes and silver-streaked dark hair, pulled back in a practical bun. She took one look at Charlie's condition and immediately sprang into action. "Bring her inside immediately." Eleanor Monroe directed her voice, carrying the kind of authority that came from years of dealing with medical emergencies. "The spare room is ready. I'll fetch hot water and my medical kit." The next few hours passed in a blur of kindness and care that Charlie had almost forgotten existed. Eleanor helped her out of her torn and dirty dress, tended to her cuts and bruises with gentle efficiency, and provided clean clothes that had belonged to the Monroe's daughter, now married and living in San Antonio. "You poor child," Eleanor murmured as she worked her eyes, taking in the older bruises and scars that marked Charlie's arms and back, evidence of Maxwell's abuse that she had tried so hard to hide. "How long were you with Holden?" "Since my mother died," Charlie replied quietly. 5 years ago." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, but she made no comment beyond a small sound of disapproval. When she had finished her ministrations, she brought Charlie a tray with a bowl of hearty beef stew, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and a cup of strong tea sweetened with honey. "Eat," she instructed kindly. "Then rest. Tomorrow will be soon enough for questions and planning." Left alone in the small but comfortable room, Charlie ate ravenously, suddenly aware of how long it had been since her last proper meal. The stew was rich and flavorful, the bread light and perfect, and she found herself thinking that this was what a real home might feel like. Safe, warm, welcoming. As she drifted toward sleep, her mind returned to Mason's revelations about her grandmother. Rose Hawk had died protecting others, just as she had lived. And somehow, impossibly, she had arranged for Charlie to be protected even after death. Tomorrow there would be decisions to make, plans to formulate, dangers to face. But for now, it was enough to know that she was no longer alone. 3 days passed in what felt like a different world from the one Charlie had known under Maxwell Holden's roof. The railroad camp operated with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, but there was a warmth and camaraderie among the workers that was completely foreign to her experience. Eleanor Monroe proved to be everything Mason had promised, and more. She treated Charlie not as a charity case or an unwelcome burden, but as a valued member of their small community. Under her guidance, Charlie found herself helping with the endless tasks required to keep 50 men fed and healthy, cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, and even assisting with minor medical procedures when workers came in with cuts or sprains. "You have good hands for this work," Eleanor observed on the second day, watching as Charlie carefully stitched up a gash on a young railroad worker's arm. "Your grandmother taught you well." It was true, Rose Hawk had passed on her knowledge of healing herbs and basic medical care. though Charlie had never imagined she would need to use those skills to earn her keep. The work was satisfying in a way that her assigned chores at the Holden farm had never been. Here she was helping people who appreciated her efforts, rather than serving a man who saw her as nothing more than unpaid labor. Of Mason Reed, however, she saw frustratingly little. He appeared at mealtimes inquiring about her health and recovery, but he seemed to be avoiding any deeper conversation. Charlie would catch glimpses of him throughout the day, riding out on mysterious errands for Franklin, conferring with other men over maps and documents, always busy with the serious business of his investigation. When their paths did cross, their interactions were polite but guarded. The intimacy of their night in the cave, the shared revelations about her grandmother, seemed to have created a strange tension between them. Charlie found herself wanting to know more about Mason Reed, about his connection to Rose Hawk, about the shadows she sometimes glimpsed in his blue eyes. But he maintained a careful distance that frustrated her more than she cared to admit. "He's a complicated man," Eleanor said one evening, as they prepared supper, clearly having noticed Charlie's frequent glances toward the door. "Lost his partner to violence a few years back, and it changed him. Made him more cautious about forming attachments." "His partner?" Charlie asked, trying to keep her tone casual. "Jim Harlan. They were Texas Rangers together before Mason took the railroad job. Good men, both of them, but they got mixed up in something bigger than they realized." Eleanor's expression grew sad. Jim didn't make it out. The pieces of Mason's story were beginning to come together, Charlie realized. His dedication to bringing Maxwell Holden to justice wasn't just professional, it was personal. Somewhere in the tangled web of crime and violence that surrounded her stepfather, Mason had lost someone important to him. On the morning of her 4th day at the camp, Charlie was helping Eleanor prepare breakfast when the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. 3 riders were coming up the main road, and Charlie recognized the lead figure with a shock of fear that nearly made her drop the plate she was holding. It was Buck Morrison, the same man who had been pursuing her the night Mason found her. His cruel face was set in lines of determination, and Charlie could see that he was armed and ready for trouble. "Eleanor," she said urgently, backing away from the window, "I need to hide, now." Eleanor took one look at Charlie's face and immediately understood. "The back room," she said quickly. "Don't come out until I give the all clear." Charlie retreated to the small storage room behind the kitchen, just as the sound of boots on the porch steps announced the visitor's arrival. Through the thin wooden door, she could hear Franklin's voice greeting the men with cool professionalism. "Gentlemen." Franklin said, his tone suggesting these were not welcome guests. "What brings you to my camp?" "Looking for railroad thieves." Morrison replied, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a predator trying to appear harmless. "Had some supplies go missing from a wagon train last week. Trail led this direction." Charlie pressed her ear to the door, her heart pounding as she listened to the conversation. The lie was so blatant, it would have been laughable if not for the danger it represented. Morrison and his companions weren't looking for thieves, they were looking for her. Funny thing. Franklin's voice carried a dangerous edge. "We've been having the same problem. Lost 2 supply wagons just last month. Perhaps we're dealing with the same gang of thieves." There was a moment of tense silence before Morrison spoke again, and Charlie could hear the strain in his voice as he tried to maintain the pretense. "Could be. That's why we're checking all the camps and settlements in the area, making sure everyone's being vigilant." "Appreciate the concern," Franklin replied dryly. "But I run a tight operation here. My men are all accounted for, and I know exactly what belongs to the railroad and what doesn't." Eleanor's voice joined the conversation, then carrying the practical authority of a woman accustomed to managing difficult situations. "Gentlemen, if you're going to be conducting business, you might as well do it over a hot meal. I've got stew on the fire and fresh coffee brewing." Despite the courtesy of the offer, Charlie could hear the underlying steel in Eleanor's voice. This was a woman who had dealt with troublemakers before and wasn't easily intimidated. The sound of scraping chairs indicated that the men had accepted the invitation, probably calculating that refusing would appear suspicious. For the next 20 minutes, Charlie listened to the stilted conversation as Morrison and his companions ate Eleanor's food while fishing for information about the camp's inhabitants. "We're also looking for a young woman," Morrison finally said, dropping the pretense about stolen supplies. "About 19, dark hair. Name of Charlotte Fletcher. She's Maxwell Holden's stepdaughter, ran off after stealing some family valuables. Mr. Holden's offering a $50 reward for information leading to her return." Charlie held her breath, waiting for Franklin's response. $50 was more money than most of these men would see in 2 months. It would be tempting to anyone who didn't know the truth about Maxwell Holden. "Haven't seen any young women around here?" Franklin replied evenly. "This is a work camp, Morrison, not a boarding house. People don't just wander through." "Mind if we take a look around?" Morrison pressed. "Girl might have passed through without your knowing. Maybe one of your men gave her shelter without thinking." "I mind very much." Franklin's tone had hardened to steel. "My men are honest workers, not harbors of thieves or runaways. You've seen the camp, you've eaten our food. Now it's time for you to move along." Charlie heard the scrape of chairs being pushed back, followed by the sound of heavy boots on wooden floors. Through a crack in the door, she caught a glimpse of Morrison's face as he passed by, and the frustrated anger she saw there made her blood run cold. "We'll be moving on then," Morrison said, his false politeness not quite masking his fury. "But if anyone sees this Fletcher girl, they should remember that Mr. Holden is her legal guardian and has every right to her return." "We'll keep that in mind," Franklin replied coldly. After the men left, Charlie remained hidden until Eleanor came to fetch her, her kind face creased with concern. "They're gone, dear, but they'll be back. Men like that don't give up easily." Franklin was waiting in the main room, his weathered face grim. $50, he said with disgust. "They're hunting you like an escaped prisoner. Maxwell can't afford to let me go." Charlie replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I know too much about his operation." "Then we need to get you somewhere safer than this camp," Franklin said decisively. "Somewhere Holden and his men wouldn't think to look." Just then, Mason appeared in the doorway, having returned from whatever errand had taken him away that morning. His face was tight with controlled anger, and Charlie realized he must have encountered Morrison's group on the road. "They'll be back," he said without preamble, "and next time they won't be satisfied with being politely turned away." Franklin nodded grimly. "My thoughts exactly. We need to move her tonight." "Where?" Charlie asked, though she dreaded the answer. The camp had begun to feel like home, and the thought of leaving Eleanor's kindness and protection made her heart ache. "I know a place," Mason said, his blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Somewhere your grandmother would have wanted you to go." They left the camp under cover of darkness, Mason leading Charlie on a sturdy bay mare that Franklin had insisted she take as payment for her work. "Every woman should have her own horse," he had said gruffly, pressing the reins into her hands, along with a small leather pouch containing her wages, especially in country like this. The mare was named Willow, Franklin explained, for her graceful movement and dark coloring. She was older than Mason's stallion, but steady and reliable, with kind eyes and a gentle disposition that immediately endeared her to Charlie. As they rode through the moonlit landscape, Charlie found herself thinking that this was the first thing she had ever truly owned, not something given to her grudgingly by Maxwell, but something earned through honest work and given freely by people who cared about her welfare. They traveled northeast, following game trails and creek beds that would conceal their passage from any pursuit. Mason set a careful pace, balancing the need for speed with the importance of keeping the horses fresh for what might become a desperate flight. "Tell me about this place we're going," Charlie said during one of their brief stops to rest the animals. Mason was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been reverence. "Red Rock Canyon," he said. "About 2 days' ride from here. It's where your grandmother lived before she came to stay with your family." Charlie felt a jolt of surprise. "I didn't know she had her own place. I thought she'd always lived with us." "Only after your mother married Holden," Mason replied. "Before that, Rose had a cabin in the canyon, hidden away where she could practice the old ways without interference." The thought that her grandmother had maintained an independent life, a place where she could be truly herself, filled Charlie with a mixture of sadness and hope. Sadness for the life Rose had given up to help care for her family, and hope that some piece of that world might still exist. "Is it still there?" she asked. "The cabin?" Mason nodded. "I've been maintaining it. Seemed wrong to let it go to ruin." The simple kindness of this gesture, maintaining her grandmother's home, when there had been no certainty Charlie would ever see it, touched her deeply. Here was a man who honored debts of gratitude even when no one was watching, who kept faith with the dead as faithfully as he protected the living. They rode through the night and well into the next day, stopping only when necessary to rest the horses or refill their water bottles from the clear streams that crossed their path. The landscape gradually changed around them, and the rolling hills giving way to more dramatic terrain carved from red sandstone and limestone. By late afternoon on the second day, they were traveling through country unlike anything Charlie had ever seen. Towering formations of red rock rose from the earth, like ancient cathedrals, their surfaces carved and sculpted by wind and rain into fantastic shapes. The stone glowed with an inner fire in the slanting sunlight, and Charlie found herself understanding why her grandmother might have been drawn to such a place. "Red Rock Country," Mason explained when they paused to rest on a ridge overlooking a deep canyon. "Your grandmother said it was sacred to her people, a place where the earth itself spoke to those who knew how to listen." As they descended into the canyon itself, Charlie felt a sense of coming home that she had never experienced before. The air was cooler here, sheltered from the burning Texas sun by the towering walls. A small stream meandered along the canyon floor, supporting a ribbon of green vegetation, cottonwoods and willows, wild grapevines, and climbing roses that filled the air with their sweet fragrance. And there, nestled against the western wall like a natural part of the landscape, was the cabin. It was smaller than Charlie had expected, built partially into the rock face itself so that it seemed to grow from the stone. The wooden walls were weathered to a silvery gray that blended perfectly with the natural stone, and the roof was covered with sod that supported a garden of native grasses and wildflowers. "She built it herself," Mason said quietly as they approached. "Chose this spot because it's sheltered from the worst weather and has access to fresh water year-round." Charlie dismounted from Willow and approached the cabin on foot, her heart pounding with anticipation and something that might have been fear. This was a piece of her grandmother's life that she had never known existed, a secret world that Rose had somehow managed to preserve despite the pressures and demands of the life she had chosen with Charlie's family. The door was made of thick oak planks, weathered but solid. Charlie hesitated with her hand on the latch, suddenly uncertain. What right did she have to enter this private sanctuary? What if she found things that her grandmother had never intended for her to see? "She would have wanted you to see it," Mason said gently, seeming to read her thoughts. "She talked about bringing you here someday when it was safe." Charlie lifted the latch and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked slightly, but the door swung smoothly, revealing the interior of the cabin. She stepped inside Mason, following behind her, and immediately felt the presence of her grandmother in every carefully arranged detail. The cabin was a single large room, but it felt spacious and welcoming rather than cramped. Shelves lined the walls filled with books, jars of herbs, tools, and objects, that Charlie recognized as having significance in traditional Hawk culture. A comfortable bed occupied one corner, covered with a quilt that Charlie remembered her grandmother working on during long winter evenings. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its hearth swept clean, but ready for use. But it was the small details that brought tears to Charlie's eyes. A wooden mortar and pestle used for grinding herbs, worn smooth by decades of use. A basket woven in the distinctive pattern of her grandmother's tribe, its geometric designs telling stories that Charlie wished she had learned to read. A collection of smooth river stones, arranged on a shelf, each one chosen for some special quality that had caught Rose's attention. On a table near the window sat a familiar object that made Charlie's breath catch in her throat, her grandmother's medicine bag, made of soft doe skin and decorated with intricate beadwork. Charlie had seen Rose use it countless times, selecting herbs and remedies for various ailments. But she had assumed it was lost or destroyed after her grandmother's death. She hid it here before she died. Mason explained, watching Charlie examine the bag with reverent hands. Along with other things she wanted to keep safe. Charlie opened the bag carefully, breathing in the familiar scent of the herbs her grandmother had gathered and prepared. Inside were dozens of small packets and vials, each one labeled in Rose's careful handwriting, with both English and Hawk names for the plants they contained. There were also small objects of power, a piece of turquoise, an eagle feather, a carved bone whistle that had belonged to Charlie's great-grandfather. "She taught me to use some of these," Charlie said softly, holding up a packet of herbs she recognized as a remedy for fever. "But I never understood how much knowledge she carried. She was the last of the traditional healers among her people," Mason replied. "When the reservation was established, most of the tribe was forced to abandon the old ways. Rose was one of the few who managed to preserve that knowledge." As Charlie continued to explore the cabin, she found more treasures from her grandmother's past. A trunk at the foot of the bed contained clothing and personal items, including the doe-skin dress Rose had worn for special ceremonies and a pair of intricately beaded moccasins that were works of art in their own right. On a high shelf near the fireplace, she discovered a collection of books that surprised her. Some were in English, a worn Bible, several volumes of poetry, a medical text that was decades old but still useful. Others were written in the Hawk language, their pages covered with the flowing script her grandmother had taught herself to preserve the stories and traditions of her people. "She was remarkable," Mason said quietly, watching Charlie examine the books with wonder. "Educated herself, preserved her culture, healed anyone who came to her for help, and never asked for anything in return except respect." "Why didn't she tell me about this place?" Charlie asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "Because Maxwell would have found a way to take it from her," Mason replied. "Or use it against her." Rose knew that some things were too precious to risk. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, Mason built a fire in the hearth while Charlie prepared a simple meal from the supplies they had brought. The familiar routine of domestic tasks helped ground her in the present moment, even as her mind reeled from the discoveries of the day. "What happens now?" she asked, as they sat before the fire sharing bread and dried meat while the canyon settled into peaceful darkness around them. Mason was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of grim determination that sent a shiver down Charlie's spine. "Now we finish what your grandmother started," he said. "We gather the evidence we need to bring Maxwell Holden to justice." "What kind of evidence?" Charlie asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Documents, records, proof of his crimes that even his bought judges can't ignore." Mason's jaw tightened. "And there's only one place to find them." Charlie felt her blood turn to ice. "The Holden farm," Mason nodded grimly. "It's dangerous, more dangerous than anything we've done so far. But it's the only way to get what we need. I know where he keeps his important papers," Charlie said quietly. There's a safe in his study behind a painting of my mother. He made me memorize the combination so I could fetch documents for him when he was too drunk to remember it himself. Something flickered in Mason's eyes, surprise, admiration, calculation. That could be exactly what we need. But Charlie, I have to be honest with you, if we do this, if we go back to that farm, there's a good chance we won't make it out alive. Charlie thought of James Wilson begging for his life in the barn. She thought of her grandmother dying alone while trying to warn others about Maxwell's plans. She thought of all the other innocent people who had suffered and died because Maxwell Holden believed himself above the law. Then we'd better make sure we succeed, she said firmly, because I won't let him hurt anyone else. Mason studied her face in the firelight, seeing the determination that had replaced the frightened girl he had rescued on the prairie. There's something else, he said. If we're going back to the farm, I want to try to make contact with your brothers. No promises. If it's too dangerous, we leave them behind. But if there's a chance to get them out. Charlie's heart leaped with hope and fear in equal measure. Jacob and Thomas were still trapped under Maxwell's control, still enduring the same brutal treatment she had escaped. The thought of rescuing them filled her with desperate hope. But she also knew the additional risk it would entail. They sleep in a small room off the kitchen, she said. Jacob is 17 now, Thomas 15. Maxwell works them from dawn to dusk, but they're strong and smart. If we can convince them to trust us. We'll try, Mason promised. But the mission comes first. If saving them compromises our ability to gather the evidence we need, we may have to choose. It was a hard choice, but Charlie understood the logic behind it. Without proof of Maxwell's crimes, he would continue to hurt people with impunity. Her brothers were important, but they were only 2 lives weighed against the dozens or hundreds Maxwell might harm in the future. I understand, she said quietly. That night, Charlie slept in her grandmother's bed, surrounded by the comforting presence of Rose's belongings and the peaceful silence of the canyon. Her dreams were filled with visions of the past, her grandmother, as a young woman, building this sanctuary with her own hands. Rose teaching the traditional ways to children who would carry that knowledge into an uncertain future. And always the image of her grandmother's face, as Mason had described it, in those final moments, determined to protect her granddaughter even as her own life ebbed away. When she woke in the morning, Charlie felt a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. She was no longer just running from Maxwell Holden. She was moving toward something greater than herself, carrying forward the legacy of courage and sacrifice that her grandmother had begun. They spent the next 2 days in careful preparation, planning their approach to the Holden farm, with the meticulous attention to detail that might mean the difference between success and disaster. Charlie drew detailed maps of the property from memory, marking every building, every door and window, every routine and habit that might help them move undetected through familiar territory that would now be hostile ground. The dogs are the biggest problem, she explained, sketching the patrol routes of Maxwell's 3 hunting hounds. They roam freely at night, and they know my scent. Even if we avoid the human guards, the dogs will give us away. Mason nodded thoughtfully. Your grandmother mentioned something about that once. Said she had ways of moving through the forest without disturbing the animals. Charlie's eyes lit up with sudden memory. The masking mixture. She taught me how to make it a blend of herbs and other materials that confuses an animal's sense of smell. She moved to Rose's medicine bag, selecting several packets of dried plants. Sage cedar wildflower pollen and a few other things. It makes you smell like part of the natural landscape instead of a human intruder. Working together, they prepared the mixture according to Rose's traditional recipe, boiling the herbs in water from the canyon stream until the liquid was dark and pungent. When it cooled, Mason tested it by applying some to his clothes and approaching a family of deer that came to drink at the stream each evening. The animals showed no alarm at his presence, continuing to graze peacefully even when he passed within a few feet of them. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. he said with genuine admiration as they watched the deer move away without haste or fear. In addition to the scent masking, they prepared other supplies that might prove essential. Mason cleaned and checked his weapons, not just the revolver he wore openly, but a smaller pistol concealed in an ankle holster and a knife sheathed at the small of his back. Charlie gathered medical supplies from her grandmother's collection, knowing that injuries were likely and that they might need to treat wounds without access to a doctor. Always have a backup, Mason explained when Charlie asked about the multiple weapons. And a backup for your backup. In a situation like this, you can't have too many options. On their final evening in the canyon, as they sat before the fire, making last-minute adjustments to their plan, Charlie asked the question that had been haunting her for days. Mason, after this is over, assuming we survive, what happens then? Where do we go? Mason stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. That depends on what you want, Charlie. You'll have choices you've never had before. The railroad would offer you a job. Eleanor Monroe has already mentioned that you'd be welcome back at the camp any time. Or you could stay here in your grandmother's canyon. Fix up the cabin, maybe start a school for the local children. What about you? She asked quietly. I'll keep working for the railroad, I suppose. There's always another criminal to track down, another wrong to set right. His voice carried a note of weariness that made Charlie's heart ache for him. That sounds lonely, she observed. Mason glanced at her, and in his blue eyes she saw a vulnerability he rarely allowed to show. It has been, he admitted. But it's the life I chose after Jim died. Seemed safer to work alone, not to get too attached to anyone. And now? Charlie asked, her pulse quickening at the intensity of his gaze. Now I'm beginning to think that some attachments might be worth the risk, he said quietly. Before Charlie could respond to this unexpected confession, Mason stood abruptly and moved to check their horses, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. But his words lingered in her mind as she prepared for sleep, offering a glimpse of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The next morning dawned clear and hot, perfect weather for their dangerous mission. They left Red Rock Canyon at first light, following a circuitous route that would bring them to the Holden farm from an unexpected direction. The ride took most of the day, and they made their final camp in a grove of oak trees about 2 miles from their target. As the sun set behind the western hills, they applied the scent-masking mixture to their clothes, skin, and hair. The smell was strong and earthy, like rich soil and growing things. But Charlie found it oddly comforting, a connection to her grandmother's wisdom that would help protect them in the dangerous hours ahead. Remember the plan, Mason said as they prepared to leave their horses and continue on foot. We approach from the creek side using the cottonwoods for cover. You head for your brother's room while I access the safe. We meet at the old oak behind the smokehouse, and if anything goes wrong, don't wait for me. Get to the horses and ride for Red Rock Canyon. Charlie nodded, her heart pounding but her mind clear. What if my brothers won't come? What if they think it's a trap? Then you leave them, Mason said firmly. I know it's hard, but you can't force people to accept help they don't want. And you can't save everyone, Charlie. Sometimes the best you can do is save yourself. It was harsh advice, but Charlie understood the wisdom behind it. She had learned through 5 years of Maxwell's cruelty that survival sometimes required impossible choices. They left their horses securely tied in the oak grove and began the careful approach to the farm on foot. The night was perfect for their purposes, a new moon providing minimal light, a gentle breeze that would help carry their scent away from the guard dogs, and enough cloud cover to obscure their movement across the open ground. The familiar landscape of Charlie's former prison looked strange and threatening in the darkness. Every shadow might conceal an enemy, every sound could signal discovery and death. But the scent-masking mixture seemed to work perfectly. They passed within 30 feet of one of the hunting hounds without the animal showing any sign of alarm. At the edge of the farmyard, then they separated according to plan. Mason melted into the shadows, heading for the rear of the main house where Maxwell's study window offered access to the safe. Charlie crept toward the kitchen door, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure everyone in the house must be able to hear it. The kitchen door was unlocked, as it always was, until Maxwell made his final rounds before retiring. Charlie eased it open, slowly wincing at the faint creak of the hinges. Inside the kitchen was dark, except for the dying embers in the hearth, and she allowed her eyes a moment to adjust before moving toward the small door that led to her brother's sleeping quarters. Her hand hesitated on the latch as a wave of emotion threatened to overwhelm her. What if Jacob and Thomas blamed her for abandoning them? What if they refused to listen to her explanation? What if Maxwell had turned them against her during the weeks since her escape? Pushing these fears aside, Charlie opened the door and slipped into the small, cramped room where her brothers slept. She could make out their shapes in the darkness, Jacob's tall, lean frame in one narrow bed, Thomas's smaller form curled tightly in the other. Both boys looked thinner than she remembered, and even in sleep their faces showed the strain of the hard labor and constant fear that defined their lives. Moving to Jacob's side first, Charlie placed a gentle hand over his mouth to prevent any startled exclamation. His eyes snapped open immediately, his body tensing for fight or flight. But recognition dawned quickly in his familiar brown eyes. "Charlie," he whispered against her palm, his voice cracking with disbelief. She nodded, removing her hand and putting a finger to her lips to signal silence. Jacob sat up slowly, staring at her, as though she might be a ghost or a dream, rather than flesh and blood. "Is it really you?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Yes," she confirmed, squeezing his hand. "I've come back for you and Thomas." At the sound of his name, the younger boy stirred in his bed. Jacob immediately moved to wake him, repeating Charlie's gesture of covering his mouth before he could cry out in surprise. "Thomas, wake up," Jacob murmured urgently. "Charlie's here." Thomas's reaction was more volatile than his older brother's. He jerked upright, pushing Jacob's hand away. His eyes wild with a mixture of confusion, hope, and anger that had been building for weeks. "On Charlie." He hissed, his voice loud enough to make both his siblings wince. "What the hell are you doing here? If Maxwell finds you, he won't." Charlie interrupted, keeping her voice to the barest whisper. "But we don't have much time. I need you both to listen carefully." Quickly and quietly, she outlined the situation. Mason's presence, their plan to gather evidence against Maxwell, and their intention to take the boys with them when they fled. Jacob listened with growing hope and determination, nodding his understanding of the risks and rewards. Thomas remained skeptical, his young face hardened by years of abuse and disappointment. "So we're supposed to just run away with you and some stranger?" he demanded, though he had the sense to keep his voice low. "To where, to what?" "To freedom," Charlie said simply. "To a life where Maxwell can't hurt us anymore." "At least here we have food and shelter," Thomas argued. "And we know what to expect, out there." He gestured vaguely toward the window. "Out there is nothing but uncertainty. And beatings," Jacob reminded him sharply. "And no future except becoming like Dawson and the others, Maxwell's hired thugs living on scraps and cruelty." Thomas scowled, but didn't argue the point. Charlie pressed their advantage, reaching into her pocket to withdraw a small object, a wooden horse that Thomas had carved for her years ago, during one of the brief periods when Maxwell's attention had been focused elsewhere. "You gave this to me for my 15th birthday," she said softly, pressing the carved figure into his hands. "Told me it would carry me away from here someday. Maybe it's time to let it do its job." The familiar toy, preserved despite everything that had happened, seemed to crack something in Thomas's hardened exterior. His eyes filled with tears, he quickly blinked away, and when he looked up at Charlie again, she saw the boy he had been before. Maxwell's cruelty began to calcify his heart. "Where will we go?" he asked quietly. Somewhere safe, Charlie promised. Somewhere Maxwell can't find us. And after that, we'll have choices. Real choices for the first time in our lives. Jacob was already reaching for his clothes, his mind made up. What do you need us to do? Get dressed quickly, Charlie instructed. Pack only what you absolutely must, have nothing that will slow us down. Then help me search Maxwell's bedroom while he's still in his study. His bedroom. Thomas looked alarmed. Why? We need documents, letters, anything that might prove his crimes. My friend is checking the safe in the study, but Maxwell might keep other evidence elsewhere. The boys dressed with practiced silence, gathering a few precious possessions into small bundles that could be easily carried. When they were ready, Charlie led them from their room into the main part of the house, her every sense alert for any sign of danger. The hallway leading to Maxwell's bedroom was dark and quiet, with only a thin line of light showing beneath the closed door of the study at the far end. Maxwell was still working, probably drinking as well, which would make him less likely to hear their careful movement through the house. Maxwell's bedroom was spacious, but oppressive, filled with heavy furniture and thick curtains that seemed to absorb light and hope with equal efficiency. The air was thick with the lingering smell of cigars and whiskey, underlaid with something else, a sour smell that Charlie associated with Maxwell's particular brand of cruelty. Check the desk, Charlie whispered, moving toward a large wardrobe against the far wall. Look for correspondence account books, anything with names and figures. The three siblings searched methodically, years of navigating Maxwell's volatile moods, having taught them to work in near-perfect silence. Jacob found a locked drawer in the desk, and after a moment's hesitation, forced it open with a letter opener. Inside was a stack of papers bound with string and a small leather-bound journal. Letters, he whispered, scanning them quickly in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. From someone named Garrison. They're talking about merchandise and shipments, but being very careful with the wording. Take them, Charlie instructed, turning her attention to the wardrobe. The journal, too. Meanwhile, Thomas had discovered something even more interesting, a false bottom in one of the dresser drawers concealing a leather pouch heavy with gold coins and several folded documents bearing official seals. Land deeds, he murmured, examining them by moonlight. But they're not in Maxwell's name. But then from the dresser, Thomas held up something that made Charlie's blood freeze. A small glass vial, half empty, with a handwritten label that simply read, "Medicine for Mrs. Holden." Charlie recognized it immediately, the same type of bottle that had sat beside her mother's bed during those final agonizing weeks. The liquid inside was clear, but she remembered how her mother had complained about the bitter taste. How Maxwell had insisted she drink it all for her health. "What is it?" Jacob asked, seeing Charlie's stricken expression. Before she could answer, a sound from the hallway made all three of them freeze in terror. The unmistakable tread of heavy boots moving toward the bedroom door with the confident stride of a man in his own domain. Maxwell was coming. "Hide," Charlie hissed, pushing her brothers toward the wardrobe. Now, there was no time for discussion or debate. Jacob and Thomas squeezed into the large wardrobe, pulling the doors closed just as the bedroom door began to open. Charlie, caught in the open with nowhere to go, dropped to the floor and rolled under the high bed, pressing herself against the wall and trying to make herself as small as possible. Maxwell Holden entered his bedroom, humming tunelessly under his breath, a sign that he had indeed been drinking heavily in his study. Charlie could see only his boots and the lower part of his legs from her hiding place. But even that limited view was enough to send waves of terror through her body. This was the man who had dominated and terrorized her life for 5 years, who had killed her grandmother, and God knew how many other innocent people. Now only a few feet of space and the element of surprise separated them. And Charlie found herself fighting the urge to simply curl up in a ball and wait for discovery. Maxwell moved about the room with the unhurried movements of a man, completely secure in his power, removing his boots, his gun belt, his vest. The routine was familiar, from the countless nights Charlie had lain awake in her own room, listening for the sounds that would tell her whether Maxwell was settling in for the night or preparing for one of his late-night inspections of the house. The wardrobe doors opened, and Charlie's heart nearly stopped. But Maxwell merely hung up his vest and closed the doors again, apparently noticing nothing unusual about their contents. He moved to the washstand and began his nightly ablutions, splashing water on his face and muttering under his breath about railroad inspectors and other annoyances. Charlie realized this might be their only chance to escape undetected. As quietly as she could manage, she slid out from under the bed and crept toward the wardrobe, opening the doors just enough to make eye contact with her wide-eyed brothers. She gestured urgently toward the bedroom door, mouthing the word, "now." Jacob nodded, clutching the papers and journal they had found. He helped Thomas out of the wardrobe, and together the three siblings crept toward the door, each step a potential disaster. They had almost reached the hallway when catastrophe struck. Thomas, perhaps nervous or simply unlucky, bumped against a small table near the door. The impact sent a crystal decanter crashing to the floor, where it shattered with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. What the hell was that? Maxwell's voice bellowed from the washroom, followed immediately by the sound of his heavy footsteps. "Who's there?" "Run," Charlie urged, abandoning all pretense of stealth. The three burst into the hallway just as Maxwell emerged from the washroom, his face contorted with rage and disbelief as he spotted the intruders. His roar of fury seemed to shake the very walls of the house. "You stop right there, you little bitch." They fled toward the kitchen door, Maxwell's bellows echoing behind them and surely alerting every man on the property to their presence. But as they rounded the corner into the main living area, they found their path blocked by a familiar figure, Dawson revolver already drawn, and a cold smile spreading across his scarred face. "Well, well." He drawled his voice, carrying the satisfied tone of a hunter who had finally cornered his quarry. "Look who's come home." Charlie skidded to a halt, her brothers nearly colliding with her back. They were trapped, Maxwell approaching from behind Dawson, blocking their exit, and the sound of other men being roused by the commotion growing louder by the second. In that moment of frozen terror, new sounds entered the chaos, breaking glass from the direction of Maxwell's study, followed by a gunshot and a cry of pain. Mason had encountered his own trouble, but his distraction provided the opportunity they desperately needed. Operating on pure instinct and desperation, Charlie grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the kitchen counter and hurled it with all her strength at Dawson's head. The improvised weapon caught him squarely in the temple with a sickening thud, sending him crashing to the floor unconscious, his revolver skittering across the wooden planks. "Go!" she shouted to her brothers, pushing them toward the door. "Head for the oak tree behind the smokehouse." They burst out into the night, the relative quiet of the countryside shattered by shouts, barking dogs, and the sound of men running in all directions. The scent-masking mixture might still conceal them from the hounds, but it couldn't hide the visible fact of their flight, as lanterns began to illuminate the farmyard. Racing across the open ground between the house and the outbuildings, Harley led her brothers toward the massive oak that served as their rendezvous point with Mason. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential enemy, every sound might herald the arrival of armed pursuit. The old tree loomed ahead, its gnarled branches offering scant concealment against the growing number of lights behind them. As they pressed themselves against its massive trunk, gasping for breath, Thomas spoke the question that was in all their minds. "Where's your friend?" he asked urgently. Before Charlie could answer, a figure materialized from the darkness beside them, causing all three to start in alarm. But it was Mason, his face grim, and a streak of blood visible on his temple, though his eyes were clear and focused. "Change of plans," he said tersely, pulling a small bundle from his pocket that Charlie recognized as dynamite, a tool commonly used in railroad construction for clearing obstacles. "Holden's got the whole place stirred up looking for us. We need a diversion to reach the horses." Working with practiced efficiency, Mason set the charge against the wall of a storage shed filled with hay and farm equipment. "When it blows, run for the creek," he instructed, lighting the fuse with a match. "Don't stop for anything and don't look back." The explosion, when it came, was more powerful than Charlie had expected. A concussive blast that seemed to lift the ground beneath their feet, followed immediately by a towering column of flame as the dry hay ignited. The entire shed was consumed in moments, casting wild shadows across the farmyard and drawing every man on the property toward the fire. Using the confusion and the shifting light, the four fugitives sprinted toward the creek that marked the northern boundary of Maxwell's property. They plunged into the shallow water without hesitation, using its course to mask their footprints and provide a guide away from the burning chaos behind them. The cold water numbed Charlie's feet as they splashed downstream, but she pushed forward relentlessly, driven by the knowledge that capture would mean death for all of them. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit gradually faded as Maxwell's men focused on preventing the fire from spreading to other buildings. After a quarter-mile of following the creek, Mason led them out of the water and into a dense stand of cottonwoods, following what seemed to be an invisible path through the darkness. Charlie realized they were circling back toward where they had left the horses, approaching from a different direction to avoid any potential ambush. The animals were exactly where they had left them, though nervous and agitated from the distant sounds of commotion. Mason quickly checked that their supplies were undisturbed, then helped Thomas mount behind Jacob on Willow. The sturdy mare accepted the double burden without complaint, her kind nature making her perfect for the younger, less experienced rider. "We need to put as much distance as possible between us and the farm before dawn," Mason said, swinging into his own saddle with practiced ease. "They'll be organizing search parties once they get that fire under control." They set off at a gallop, leaving the burning barn and shouting men far behind them as they headed northeast toward the safety of Red Rock Canyon. The night enfolded them like a protective cloak, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats marking their flight from Maxwell Holden's domain of cruelty and fear. Only when they had covered several miles did Mason slow their pace to something the horses could sustain over the long journey ahead. In the relative quiet that followed, Thomas finally found his voice. "Did you get what you needed?" he asked Mason directly, his tone carrying a new note of respect for the man who had risked everything to rescue them. Mason patted his saddlebag significantly. "Ledger's correspondence records of every robbery and payoff for the past 2 years, he confirmed. "Combined with what you found and the letters, land deeds, and gold, it should be enough to convince even the most corrupt judge that Maxwell Holden is guilty of murder and theft on a massive scale." "What about that bottle Thomas found?" Charlie asked quietly. "The medicine for my mother." Mason's expression darkened. "We'll have the contents analyzed when we reach Austin. If it's what I think it is, arsenic or some other poison, it'll be one more charge against Holden. Murder in the first degree." The thought that Maxwell had slowly poisoned her mother, watching her suffer day after day, while pretending to care for her health, filled Charlie with a cold rage that was somehow more frightening than the hot anger she had felt earlier. This wasn't just cruelty, it was calculated evil of the deepest kind. "What happens now?" Jacob asked, his arm tightening protectively around his younger brother. "Now we get this evidence to the federal marshal in Austin," Mason replied. "And we hope that justice still means something in Texas." As they rode through the remainder of the night, Charlie found herself thinking about the papers hidden in Mason's saddlebag. For years, Maxwell had seemed untouchable, protected by money and connections and the simple fact that dead men couldn't testify against him. But now, finally, they had proof of his crimes written in his own hand and signed with his own name. The thought of Maxwell facing a judge and jury of him, finally being held accountable for all the lives he had destroyed, filled Charlie with a fierce satisfaction. Justice had been too long delayed, but it was finally within reach. They reached Red Rock Canyon as the sun was rising, painting the sandstone walls in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The horses were exhausted, their coats dark with sweat, but they had covered the distance without serious incident. More importantly, There had been no sign of organized pursuit during the long night's ride. Jacob and Thomas stared in wonder at the hidden canyon as Mason led them through the narrow entrance passage. This was their first glimpse of the larger world beyond Maxwell's farm, and Charlie could see their amazement at the natural beauty that surrounded them. "Grandmother lived here?" Thomas asked in an awed whisper as they approached the cabin nestled against the western wall. "For many years," Charlie confirmed. "This was her sanctuary, her place of peace." Inside the cabin, her brothers examined their grandmother's possessions with the reverence of pilgrims visiting a shrine. They had known Rose primarily as she appeared at the farm, a woman forced to be careful and circumspect under Maxwell's watchful eye. Here, surrounded by her books and tools and medicines, they could see her as she truly was, a keeper of ancient wisdom, a healer, a bridge between two worlds. "I remember this," Jacob said softly, picking up the carved bone whistle that had belonged to their great-grandfather. "She showed it to me once, told me it was used to call the spirits in times of great need. She told me the spirits of our ancestors lived in the stars." Thomas added, examining a collection of star charts and astronomical observations Rose had made over the years. "Said they were always watching over us, even when we couldn't see them." Charlie felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her brothers discover this hidden aspect of their heritage. Maxwell had done his best to cut them off from their past, to make them ashamed of their mixed blood and their grandmother's heathen ways. But here in Rose's sanctuary, they could finally understand the richness and beauty of the culture they had inherited. As the day progressed, Charlie found herself watching Mason work with growing admiration. His dedication to justice wasn't just professional, it was personal, driven by the loss of his partner and his promise to her grandmother. But more than that, she was beginning to understand the kind of man he truly was. Methodical, patient, utterly committed to doing what was right, regardless of the personal cost. That evening, as they sat around a small fire outside the cabin, Thomas asked the question that had been weighing on all their minds. "What if it doesn't work?" he said quietly. "What if Maxwell's connections are stronger than the evidence we've gathered? What if he finds a way to make this all disappear?" It was Jacob who answered, his voice carrying a new note of maturity and determination. "Then we keep fighting," he said simply. "We don't give up no matter what happens. Grandmother didn't give up when things looked hopeless, and neither will we." Charlie felt a surge of pride at her brother's words. The frightened, beaten boys Maxwell had tried to create were gone, replaced by young men who understood the value of courage and the importance of standing up for what was right. "Jacob's right," Mason said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Justice isn't something that happens automatically. It's something you have to fight for every day against people who would rather see it buried and forgotten." The journey to Austin took 4 days of careful travel through back roads and forgotten trails, avoiding the main routes where Maxwell's men might be watching for them. Mason set a steady but sustainable pace, mindful of the horse's condition and the need to avoid attracting unwanted attention. They reached the outskirts of Austin. In the early afternoon of the 4th day, their horses travel-worn, but still strong enough to carry them through the final miles of their journey. The city was bustling with activity. Merchants, farmers, government officials, and citizens going about their daily business in the complex dance of commerce and politics that defined the state capital. Mason led them through the less fashionable sections of town, avoiding the main thoroughfares where they might be spotted by the wrong people. Their destination was the federal courthouse, where Marshal James Harland Mason's murdered partner's brother waited to receive the evidence that would finally bring Maxwell Holden to justice. But as they rounded a corner near the courthouse, Charlie's blood turned to ice. There, in the shadow of a building across the street, she recognized 3 familiar figures, Buck Morrison and 2 of his companions, watching the courthouse entrance with the patient attention of predators waiting for their prey. "We have company," she said quietly, nodding toward the watchers. Mason followed her gaze and immediately understood the implications. "They must have ridden hard to get here ahead of us," he said grimly. "Probably hoping to intercept us before we could reach the marshal. What do we do?" Jacob asked, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol Mason had given him for protection. Mason thought quickly, weighing their options. The courthouse was only a few hundred yards away, but those yards were completely exposed, offering no cover if Maxwell's men decided to act. "We split up," he decided. "Charlie, you and your brothers circle around to the back entrance while I create a distraction. If anything goes wrong, get inside and find Marshal Harland, show him the evidence, and tell him everything." "That's too dangerous," Charlie protested. "If something happens to you, then you finish the job," Mason interrupted firmly. "Charlie, you're the key witness to Wilson's murder. Your testimony combined with these documents will be enough to convict Maxwell, even if I'm not there to support it." Before anyone could argue further, Mason spurred his horse toward the main street, riding boldly into view of Maxwell's watchers. As he had expected, the sight of him drew their immediate attention, and Charlie saw them begin to move, following him as he led them away from the courthouse. "Now," she whispered to her brothers, and they slipped quietly through the back streets toward the rear entrance of the federal building. They made it inside without incident, and found Marshal Harland in his office, a stern-faced man in his 50s, who looked remarkably like the partner Mason had described. When Charlie explained who they were and what they had brought, his expression grew progressively grimmer. "These documents," he said, examining the ledgers and correspondence they had recovered. "They're more than sufficient to arrest Maxwell Holden on charges of murder robbery and criminal conspiracy. Combined with your testimony about the Wilson killing and the evidence of your mother's poisoning." He shook his head in amazement. "This is one of the most complete cases I've ever seen." "What about Maxwell's political connections?" Jacob asked. "Won't they try to protect him?" "Not from federal charges," Harland replied grimly. "And not with evidence this overwhelming. By tomorrow morning, Maxwell Holden will be in federal custody, awaiting trial for his crimes." The trial of Maxwell Holden became the sensation of Austin, and indeed, much of Texas. Newspapers from as far away as New York sent reporters to cover the proceedings, drawn by the lurid details of murder, corruption, and the dramatic rescue of the witnesses who finally brought the criminal empire crashing down. Charlie's testimony was the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. When she took the witness stand to describe what she had seen in the barn that terrible day, James Wilson's murder, Maxwell's cold calculation, the methodical division of the stolen money, her quiet, steady voice held the packed courtroom spellbound. He laughed. She said her words carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "After Mr. Wilson was dead, after they'd taken his money, Maxwell Holden laughed, as if taking a man's life was nothing more than a business transaction." Jacob and Thomas also testified, describing years of abuse and the atmosphere of fear that had pervaded their lives under Maxwell's control. Their youth and obvious sincerity made their accounts particularly powerful, and Charlie could see several jurors wiping their eyes as they listened to the boy's quiet recitation of cruelty endured. Mason's testimony about the systematic nature of Maxwell's criminal enterprise, supported by the detailed records they had recovered from the farm, painted a picture of organized crime on a scale that shocked even experienced lawmen. The railroad had suffered losses totaling tens of thousands of dollars, while at least a dozen people had died or disappeared under suspicious circumstances linked to Maxwell's operations. But perhaps the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source, Pete Garrison, Maxwell's former associate, who agreed to testify for the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence. His insider's knowledge of the organization's operations filled in crucial details that the documentary evidence alone couldn't provide. Maxwell ran that outfit like a military operation. Garrison testified, carefully avoiding eye contact with his former boss. Every job was planned down to the last detail, every witness was eliminated, every loose end was tied up. He used to say that dead men tell no tales, and he made sure to keep it that way. The prosecution also presented evidence of Maxwell's earlier crimes, including the murder of Rose Hawk. Mason's testimony about witnessing her death, combined with medical evidence about the nature of her wounds, established a pattern of violence that stretched back years. When the laboratory analysis of the medicine bottle confirmed that it contained lethal doses of arsenic, even Maxwell's expensive lawyers seemed to realize their case was hopeless. The man who had once seemed untouchable, protected by money and political connections, was revealed as nothing more than a common murderer who had simply been careful enough to avoid detection for years. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. When the foreman read the decision aloud, Charlie felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying for so long, she had forgotten what it felt like to be free of it. Maxwell's sentencing was scheduled for the following week, but there was little doubt about the outcome. Multiple convictions for murder in Texas carried only one possible penalty, and the judge had made it clear that he saw no mitigating circumstances that would justify mercy. Maxwell Holden was executed on a gray morning in November, dying without remorse or apparent fear on the gallows that had been erected in the courthouse square. Charlie chose not to attend the execution, feeling that her presence would serve no useful purpose. Justice had been served. There was no need to witness its final implementation. Instead, she spent that morning with Mason, walking through Austin's busy streets and talking about their plans for the future. It felt appropriate somehow to be discussing life and hope and new beginnings, while the man who had caused so much pain and suffering was finally facing the consequences of his actions. 3 weeks after the execution, they were married in a simple ceremony at the Austin courthouse, with Jacob and Thomas serving as witnesses and Marshal Harland performing the honors. Charlie wore a simple blue dress that Eleanor Monroe had sent from the railroad camp, while Mason wore his best suit and the bandana that had once belonged to Rose Hawk. "It seems fitting," he said when Charlie commented on his choice of neckwear. "Rose brought us together in a way. This is our way of honoring her memory." The railroad company had offered Charlie and her brothers a substantial reward for their role in exposing Maxwell's crimes and recovering the stolen money. Combined with the small inheritance from their mother that Maxwell had never been able to access legally, they would have enough money to support themselves comfortably while they decided what to do with their lives. Jacob had already made his choice. He wanted to continue working for the railroad, learning the business from the ground up with Franklin Monroe as his mentor. His quiet competence and natural leadership had impressed everyone who had worked with him, and Franklin had promised him a position as soon as he was ready. Thomas was less certain about his future, but he had shown a remarkable aptitude for mechanical things during their time at the railroad camp. Several people had suggested that he might find satisfaction as an engineer or inventor, fields that were growing rapidly as America embraced new technologies. Charlie and Mason had decided to return to Red Rock Canyon, to restore her grandmother's cabin, and create something positive from the ashes of Maxwell's evil. The railroad was planning to extend a line through that area eventually, so Mason could work on that project while Charlie established a school for the local children. "You're going to teach them more than just reading and writing," Eleanor Monroe had said when they visited the railroad camp to say their goodbyes. "You're going to teach them about their heritage, about the value of courage and justice." Rose Hawk would be so proud. On their final evening in Austin, Charlie and Mason climbed to the top of a hill overlooking the city, watching the sun set over the Texas landscape that had been the stage for so much tragedy and triumph. "Do you ever regret it?" Mason asked quietly. "Everything we went through to get to this point." Charlie considered the question seriously. The past months had been filled with danger and loss, with moments of terror that still haunted her dreams. But they had also brought her a family restored, justice served, and a love she had never dared to hope for. "No," she said finally. Every choice we made, every risk we took, led us to this moment. And this moment is worth everything we endured to reach it. Mason nodded, understanding the truth of her words. In the distance, the lights of Austin twinkled like earthbound stars. And Charlie thought of her grandmother's belief that the spirits of their ancestors watched over them from the heavens above. "Thank you, grandmother," she whispered to the evening sky, "for bringing him to me when I needed him most, for teaching me to be brave, for showing me that justice is worth fighting for, no matter the cost." The next morning, they loaded their wagon with supplies and wedding gifts, said their final farewells to friends and family, and set out for Red Rock Canyon and the life they would build together. As Austin faded behind them and the familiar landscape of Texas spread out ahead, Charlie felt a deep sense of contentment. The nightmare years under Maxwell's control were finally over, replaced by the promise of a future built on love, justice, and the preservation of knowledge that would benefit generations to come. Behind them, the past was finally laid to rest. Ahead lay a future bright with possibility, and the promise of justice served. In Red Rock Canyon, they would build their school and their life together, surrounded by the spirit of Rose Hawk and the enduring power of love, to triumph over evil. The bandana around Mason's neck would remain there, always a reminder of the promise kept, and the justice served a testament to the courage of ordinary people who choose to stand up for what is right. And in the evenings when their work was done, and the canyon walls glowed red in the setting sun, Charlie would tell her students the story of their grandmother, Rose Hawk, healer, teacher, and guardian of justice, whose courage had made it possible for a new generation to learn and grow in freedom.